Hello. This video will provide a brief applied introduction to Excel. This will be used as a reference throughout the semester, so if you have questions about how to calculate anything or use formulas in Excel, you can refer back to it. Now, we won't cover everything that we'll be calculating, but again, the main functions that we use throughout the semester, this will provide an introduction to them. Additionally, we're not going to cover why we're calculating these variables. We'll talk about that in class. So it's a very much just applied and very brief introduction. So here we can see we have the data for 10 instructors and their ratings on things like how challenging they are, how intellectually stimulating, organized, knowledgeable, enthusiastic. So these would probably be from a course like a course evaluation, and these are the scores that they've received. Now, if we didn't want to know the names of each of the individual instructors, we could input numbers to represent the individuals so that we can then make the data anonymous. One of the nice functions in Excel is once you have a couple of numbers, you can highlight the cells, and if those numbers are going in numerical order, Excel will assume as you drag down that you want to continue that numbering. So here I've put in 1 and 2, and then when I drag down further beyond that, it adds in the rest of the numbers, continuing that numerical order. Now, at this point, if I wanted to anonymize the data, I could just delete that column. And now I have data that's more consistent with how we would typically see a data set. First, I'm going to create an overall score. I'm going to create a total score for the instructor ratings. So we're going to call this teaching eval total. And I encourage you to, pause the video at this point, open up Excel, input these data in there like you see, and you can follow along, because really to learn how to use Excel, you're going to need to use it. So as informative as it may be to watch the video, watching the video and following along is really going to help you develop the skills, because part of what I'm trying to do is provide a foundation so everyone has a certain level of competency within Excel, and so when we're using this in class, individuals don't fall behind. And one of the great reasons to use a video at this point is that some of you may have used Excel before, so you come in with a fair amount of knowledge of how to use Excel. Some of you've never used it before, and so there's going to be a little bit more of a learning curve. And using the video allows you to pause the video, think about what it is that I'm doing, how did I do it, without having any pressure from people being around you while you're trying to figure out how to use this new program. Alright, so back to what we're doing. We're creating total scores for these teaching evals. So the first individual, we're going to sum all of their scores on each of the individual items. And fortunately, Excel uses a rather intuitive formula for that, which is simply sum. So we can sit there and go in, say sum, and we are in the B column, and we are on the second row, so we're going to tell it to sum B2, and then I'm going to put a colon. That's going to tell it to go from B2 to whatever the second cell is. And so there, we're going to go all the way over to column F, and we're going to still be in that second row, so we're going to go to F2. I'm going to close those parentheses, and that is going to give me the sum of those 5 items, and we see that the first individual has a total teaching evaluation score of 49. Now, to double check that, because maybe you're not familiar with the formula, we could do a more basic way, and we could say add B2 plus C2 plus D2, and so we can manually tell it to add all of these cells together without using the formula. Oh, I apologize. And we're going to see that that sum is exactly the same. So it seems that the formula is doing what we said that it would. And again, you could check online resources and see that that's what it's doing. Now the nice thing is, once I've created that formula once, because really I want to sum the scores for the second individual and the third, I can copy. So I can say Control C and then highlight these other cells, Control V, and what that does is it assumes that I'm moving forward. So now the first row there is B2 to F2, but if we look at the second row, you can see the formula for it up here. It goes B3 to F3. So B3 to F3, if you click in, you can also see exactly what formula is being used for that cell. So now we have the total scores for each individual. And we're going to begin to calculate some more basic statistics. So we're going to label that column statistics. The next column will be the values. And one of the first things that we want to calculate is the overall total. So we're going to sum all the teaching evaluation totals. So we're going to call this the sum teaching evals. And to do that, we can again use the sum formula. So we're going to tell it to sum G2 to G11 because we want to sum this column. And so just as before, the colon is in there. It means to go from whatever is in front of it, in this case cell G2, to G11. And what we see is that the total sum of these values, 49 plus 42 plus 44, going down this column, is 432. Once we have summed it, one other thing that we might want to do is know the total number of participants that are involved. So we're going to call this total participants. Because this data set is relatively small, we can easily look at it and see that there are 10 participants. However, that's not the case in a lot of data sets. So a formula that's useful is count. So we're going to tell it equals count, and we're basically going to go from our first value all the way down to our final value. And so that's going to tell us, okay, I have teaching evaluation total scores for 10 individuals. And what this count formula does, the count formula that we've used does, is it says, is there a value in this cell? If so, I'm going to count it. I'm going to increment by 1. Is there a value in this cell? If so, I'm going to increment by 1. And so long as there is a value in this cell, then it's going to go ahead and increment. It does not tell me if that value is in a certain range or if it's an appropriate value, but you can see if I remove this 42, so let's take that out, I can see that it goes, oh wait, this is a blank cell. I don't have a value for that cell, so it's not going to count that one. And I'm just going to Control C, Control V, and that'll put the value back in for me for that. Alright, now that we have a sum of our teaching evals and we have the total number of participants, we can calculate an average evaluation score. So what is the average for all 10 individuals on their total teaching evaluations? So we're going to calculate an average, which is also referred to as a mean. And when you're calculating a mean, in case it's been a while since you've done one, basically you're taking the sum and you are dividing that by the total number of scores. So in a class, if there's an evaluation or a test, the average score is simply the sum of everybody's scores. So, one person gets a 71, one person gets a 81, one person gets a 91. We sum those three together, we divide by 3, and we can find out that the average of those three is 81. But in this case, we have 432 divided by 10, and so we're going to find that our average eval score is 43.2. Now, frequently what we're going to do in this class is we are going to calculate deviations and squared deviations. And again, this is more of an applied introduction. In class, we'll talk about why do we need those scores and what do we use them for. But to calculate the deviation, what we're talking about is it's the deviation of the score from the mean. So now we have the average score, we have the mean, that 43.2, and what I'm going to look at is how far does this 49 deviate from that. So I'm going to say equals 49 minus the mean. So I want G2 minus L4 because that's where the mean is. And that's going to tell me that this score is 5.8 points above the mean. It's positive, so it's above the mean. So it's 5.8 points from the mean. Now, if I want to copy and paste here, the problem that I'm going to bump into is this is moving forward. So before, when we were copying and pasting for the teaching eval total, it worked because B2 to F2 was for the first person, B3 to F3 was for the second person, and that works. Here, because we're going G2, we do want G3 to increment. We want to move down when we copy and paste, but we don't want L4 to move down to L5. So what I'm going to do is put in a little $sign, and what that says to Excel is stay stationary. I want you to stay on, in this case, the 4th row. Now, it's not going to tell it to stay stationary on the L column. If I wanted to do that, I would have to add in a second one. Now it says stay stationary on this cell. If I move to the right or to the left column wise, I want you to stay where you are. If I move up or down row wise, I want that cell to stay where it is. And so we'll see that if I now copy and paste that, the formula that copy and paste, the G2, because we didn't put those $signs in, increments to G3 because I've moved down one row. However, the L4 stays the same. Now, in addition to copying and pasting using Control-C, Control-V, in Excel, I can simply get at the corner here, when it makes the little crosshairs, drag down to where I want it to, and it will copy and paste the value, the formula from this cell into each of the subsequent cells. So here we have G4 minus L4. On the next one we have G should be 5 minus L4, and so you can see how it's copied in the correct formula and it's using it correctly. Now, with deviation scores, one way to check that they've been created at least somewhat correctly is that we can sum them. And so we'll say sum of deviations here. Now we're just going to use the sum formula, so we're going to tell it that we want to add together each of the elements in that H column, right? So from H2 to H11, we want to add together all those things. And what you're going to see is it gives you this nice number in scientific notation, but let's make that a little bit easier. So if I go down, if I right click, go down to Format Cells, tell it that I want this to be a number, and let's tack on 4 decimal places. Then I'm going to click OK. What I see is that basically it comes out to 0, and I would expect that it would come out to 0, right? So when it was in scientific notation, it was -2 point whatever, but it was e to the -14, which says to me that really this is a very, very tiny small number. And so when I tell it that I want it to record it as a number and that I only want to give it 4 decimal places, I see that at least to 4 decimal places, this is in fact 0. And we would expect that because the deviation is around the mean. So I used the teaching eval total scores in order to create the mean in the first place. And then I look at the deviation of each of those scores around the mean that I used to create, and not surprisingly, some scores like this 49 are above the mean, some scores like 42 are below the mean, and so they're then negative, and so the positives and the negatives balance each other out. And so what I should see if I've created my deviation scores correctly is that the sum of those deviation scores is 0. Now in later calculations this becomes problematic, which is why typically what we actually use is these squared deviations. Now to calculate that, because I've already calculated the deviations from the mean, I could simply tell it that I want to refer to the deviation score and then I want it to square it. So if you do Shift 6, it gives you that little caret, which tells you that I want it to do it to the second power. I want to square this score, and that gives me 33.64. Now at some point in the course, you're probably, because we don't really use the deviation scores directly a lot of the time, you're probably going to want to just calculate the square deviations directly. So to do that, we can do the same formula that we did before. We're going to say that this teaching evaluation minus the average gives us the deviation, and then we are going to tell it to square that deviation. Again, shift 6, and then we're just going to hit the 2 to tell it that we want it to be to the second power. Now you'll notice that I put this G2 minus L4 in parentheses. The reason that I have to do that is those order of operations. So you'll remember PEMDAS, right? We're going to do parentheses first, then our exponents. Now the problem is, if I didn't put the G2 minus L4 in parentheses, it would have first squared the value in L4, and then it would have subtracted that value from G2, and that will give me the wrong calculation. So I'm going to first subtract, and then I'm going to do to the power. Now, just as we did before, I'm going to have to go into this formula and tell it that I want it to stay stationary. Because I'm not going across columns, I'm going to save myself a little bit of time and just tell it to leave the row stationary, because I know I'm not moving across columns. And then whatever preferred method you want to use for copying and pasting, Control C, Control V, or again, you can go and do the crosshairs and then just drag down. And we see from that the square deviations for each of the scores, and then we are going to add up those square deviations. This is called the sum of squares. That's how we commonly refer to it. And again, all you're doing here is adding up everything from I2 to I11, because that's the column that we're interested in. And we see that the sum of squares is 83.6.